An entire world is ready for you to start your career teaching the path to wellness.
Mastering the science of mindfulness.
And the art of coaching.
To help clients achieve mental, emotional, and physical betterment of life.
Through movement,
nutrition,
recovery, and regeneration.
Because impacting one person impacts a family.
Impacting a family impacts a community.
And impacting a community impacts the world.
Become an NASM certified wellness coach.
Well, hello and welcome to Better Than Fine on the NASM Podcast Network. I'm your host, Darlene Marshall, and when you dip your big toe, just your big toe, into the wellness space, you might notice that there's a few challenges down that road. Well, for one, the word wellness can sometimes feel ambiguous, right? What does wellness even mean? And sometimes it seems like there's just everybody out there on the internet slapping the label wellness on themselves. So it waters down. What does wellness really mean to us? Sometimes the wellness space can feel like it's not really backed in anything sciencey, and maybe it's even a little bit self-helpy. And oftentimes, the really impactful things to our wellness, to our clients' wellness, well, they're not as sexy as special mushroom supplements and widgets and magically seeming spiritual practices or like fancy expensive retreats with some influencer. So things like water and good sleep and getting movement every day, working on your emotional intelligence or your stress response, like that, those things don't seem exciting compared to like flying off to Bali on a yoga retreat, which sounds pretty great right now, actually. And my guest today knows that tension, that space, that big toe dipping in the what is this really all too well. Leona Brandwene is a master's in applied positive psychology from the University of Pennsylvania, where she is currently the associate director of education at the Positive Psychology Center. And that provides oversight to the MAP program, as well as the Applied Positive Psychology undergraduate certificate. She was the 2021 recipient of the UPenn Liberal and Professional Studies Award for Distinguished Teacher in Graduate Programs. She's on the Council of Advisors for the International Positive Psychology Association and is a scientific advisor for Trellis Health. She's also on the board of Shining Light, which is an organization that leverages positive psychology to build the well-being of incarcerated individuals. She served as a coach and a consultant for national healthcare performance improvement projects. She's worked on employee wellness and community health initiatives. She's a runner, a cyclist. She's deeply loved by her family. She supports youth. Let's try that sentence again. Supports youth sports in her community and supports her daughter as crew for her triathlons. And in my experience of her as a mentor who's helped me navigate this overlapping space of fitness, wellness, well-being, she's also just a very good person. And she seems to do all of that with grace and patience. She is an example to many of us in this space. Leona, welcome to Better Than Fine. It's been a long time coming, my friend, and I'm so excited to have you.
Oh my goodness, Darlene, that was just about the most extraordinary introduction ever. And I was sitting here thinking to myself, where is my mom, who probably still doesn't know what I do for a job? And it would have been wonderful for her to hear that. So thank you. It was lovely.
Absolutely. I got that and more in my experience and opinion of you. So welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you for so many reasons. But let's just start other than the formal introductions. Let's share with the listeners your story. How did you end up in this Venn diagram that kind of I feel like we both have found ourselves in of fitness, wellness, well-being space?
Yeah, great question. So I need to go back a little bit. I will say my daughter's a Gen Zer, and I've picked up some Gen Z terms from her, so I might pepper those in.
Please do.
And I'll say that I was part of the OG squad when it came to corporate wellness, which was back in the early 90s. So I worked for the travelers insurance companies. I had graduated with an undergraduate in exercise physiology, and I was really interested in how we could prevent some of the some of the outcomes that we were seeing in terms of the chronic illnesses that were only beginning to really climb at that point and began to, and of course now are burgeoning. So I worked with the travelers insurance companies. That was the heyday of corporate wellness. And so they were investing really heavily in how to keep their employees well. And part of the reason that they were doing that is because as a self-insured organization, they had access to claims data. So they could prove it because they had actuaries that were studying this. And so through some of their work, right, they discovered that for every dollar that they were investing in a wellness program for their employees, it was returning something like $3.40 on the dollar. So that's not a small amount. And so they continued to invest in that. And it wasn't just insurance companies, it was other organizations too. Over time, my career started to look at not only some of the behavioral drivers of well-being, but also sociocultural drivers of well-being. So our communities and what surrounds us is very important to our ability to flourish and be well. And so I did a lot of work in community health, and gradually ended up moving from healthcare, right, from the very preventive end of it to the very curative end of it, as we were working with helping and supporting people who are in ICUs. So I know that that's a lot, right? But at the end of the day, it is this Venn diagram of thinking about how these things that we call humans, right, who we are, which is, if you think about it, like every once in a while, it's this awe-striking moment of, oh my gosh, when you think about how complicated our bodies are and how uniquely they have evolved in this dance and exchange between us and the environment, but how humans can really flourish in our context, in our environment, which of course is what led me to study positive psychology and the study of well-being.
Thank you. You say like, oh, it seems like a lot, but it is a lot, and it deserves exploring, because I think it's so easy for someone who, is a millennial or is Gen Z to not necessarily realize, as one of the OG. For us, wellness programs at a corporate level are so ubiquitous that the origin story of, oh, well, it came from data about ROI, right? Return on investments, that if you put money into your people, you'll get more back in terms of fewer claims, but also higher productivity. And so it's helpful, I think, to have that like origin story, not just of you, but of this space that we're now occupying. And in the intro, I talked about the ambiguity in wellness. Do you want to kind of speak to that like amorphous nature over the time that you've spent in this space?
Yeah. So I will say, one of the interesting things, and I'm just going to pick at something you said there around the
Yeah.
ROI, right? So when we started talking about ROI, we were really talking about cost savings, right? We were talking about how to reduce claims data, how to reduce the number of hospital visits, the number of ER visits, the number of visits to a PCP or an ambulatory care specialist, right? So really, really finitely looking at the cost of healthcare and how we could manage and reduce that. That to me is on the cost savings side of the ledger, right? But one of the things that we didn't look at was what was on the other side of the ledger, which was really around what's the in a business context, what's the revenue producing side of the ledger, and that is right that people, employees who are vital, who are healthy, who are happier in their lives overall, are actually more engaged at work, right? So it's not only it's this virtuous cycle of what is good for the employee is also good for the employer. I would say back in the day, there was this attitude that employees who were exercising in the wellness facility at work weren't attending to their job, right? And that was like a tension of like, oh, work out, but don't do it too much, right? Because we want you back at your desk, right? Working on your TPS report. So it was really so it was, I would say that we've really evolved over time, right? And really thinking about not only what are the things that we're trying to reduce, right? But the things we're trying to increase. And so from that standpoint, I think wellness has gone from what started in a really medical model of how do we stop some of these terrible things from happening to how do we increase some of these things that we really know help to make our lives, our workplaces, our communities this much better.
Yeah, I appreciate you unpacking that, because, the title of this episode is Many Kinds of Wellness. And I think it's so easy for people who are passion driven into this space, like, oh, I'm going to help people, to not necessarily think about the initial motivations for companies investing in wellness were really driven by avoidance of expenditure. And now oftentimes we encounter it's driven by, what are my employees going to get out of it? Are they going to be more productive? Are they going to have fewer sick days? So I'm getting more out of the investment in the employee. And I think it's helpful for somebody who might be going into that corporate kind of wellness Wednesday lunch and learn, like trying to tap into that market, to just be aware that they're going to be expected to say, well, this is what is going to benefit not just the people, but also the employer.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll even say like so many things have evolved, right? And so many things have changed in the past 25 years. So even the metric of absenteeism, right, and sick days, as there's been this massive shift, right, in the world of shifting from separate sick time and separate vacation time to even just this lumping together of paid time off. Well, what are humans going to do? They're going to try and preserve their paid time off for vacations and for fun things, right? And so when they get sick, what are they going to do? They're going to drag themselves to work. And are they less productive? For sure, right? And so there's this concept that's called, balancing absenteeism, this concept of presenteeism, where you show up face out at work, or you're just not productive because you either don't feel well, or you've got a myriad of other things that are going on in your life, from family issues on down the line. So I think it's complicated, right, when we think about wellness. And when I think about what contributes to people's ability to be well, I have a hard time thinking of anything that doesn't, right? Because nearly everything does.
Yeah, certainly in the worlds that you and I move in, we're intimately familiar with the many things that enhance wellness. And you're listening to the Better Than Fine podcast. We're here to talk about the many kinds of wellness with my friend and mentor, Leona Brandwene. Leona, you and I have talked about in the past that we've at various times felt like the unpopular, uncool kid, I think is what you called it, in this fitness wellness space, partly because we're not out there selling mushroom coffees. Do you want to speak a little bit to what that's been like for you, and why you say that you're like the unpopular kid on the playgrounds?
First, I have to ask, what is a mushroom coffee, and why have I not had one? So that sounds
well. The makers of that coffee don't support this show, so I'm not going to pitch any particular brand, but it's supposedly enhances your productivity, and I will bring you some the next time I see you.
Okay, that's a deal. Okay, so let me just say, right. So all my
Deep
life,
sigh.
I have been really interested in the health and mental benefits of exercise, right? So caring for our health, caring for our mental well-being. And I would say in the early days, right, when the health benefits were really dialed down to like the heart attack that didn't happen, or the preventing metabolic syndrome, that does not make you the coolest kid in the room when everybody else is talking about
No.
pack, right? So it definitely made me like the uncool kid in the room to be interested in that. And I say that, let me also temper that statement with just a little bit, right? So as much as like the concept of the words body sculpting give me hives a little bit, because I cringe a little bit when I hear that, I'm also cautious about being too judgy, because I want to be clear, especially when it comes to things like physical activity. Physical activity is really hard, right? We are wired evolutionarily to conserve energy, and our ancestors who expended energy in unnecessary pursuits died, right? Because they died because they didn't have enough calories to support reproduction or to support survival. And so we've carried that evolutionary trait of the need to conserve energy into a world that is somewhat incongruent with how we're wired. So our bodies have evolved for few resources, resources that are spread very far apart, that we had to work together with other humans in order to secure. And now we live in a world that has many resources. Those resources are pretty close to us. They don't require a lot of energy expenditure to get to, partially because of labor-saving devices and sometimes labor-saving services. And so that also makes the idea of teamwork to secure some of those resources to survive somewhat irrelevant, right? So I say that, all that is to say, right, that physical activity is hard. And I know that what gets people to the table often is that word body sculpting, right? Because they are interested in how they look. They want, it starts there, but it's really a larger thing about they want to feel better in the world. They want to feel better about themselves. So I think that, what would concern me about that is I think that we need to have more durable sources of motivation. I think that we perhaps oversell the idea that we can totally change our physique through
Mm.
physical activity because that really doesn't take into account that we are genetically wired to have different body types. There's a limit in terms of what we can do in terms of changing our bodies to look like a particular norm. And so if that's our sole motivation, we're going to be able to peek behind the curtain pretty quickly and realize that it's not working. And then if that's your only source of motivation to keep moving, guess what? You're not going to move anymore, right? So I see it like as an entry point, but I think quickly we need to diversify and help people to see other benefits related to physical activity, especially like mental health benefits, because I think them seeing some of the really short-term benefits is a way to create a more enduring relationship with physical activity.
I so appreciate you framing this conversation around like our evolutionary predisposition to want to, like as you said, conserve calories. My brain wants to say sit on your butt. Because so often I feel like these conversations in this space are about, how to make clients do things or how to, it just feels very shamey and blamey and negative. And to recognize that, like, no, sitting on the couch does feel good. You've got to have a reason that motivates you for you and what you want for yourself. And kind of to your point about that lasting motivation, like there's a body of evidence that's showing that, exercising because you want to look good in your skivvies has an expiration point. And if you haven't found some other reason to go, like, you know, that you like it or that you have friends that do it or that it feels good, that's going to wane and then you revert. And then you get mad at yourself.
Absolutely, absolutely. And with that, it's not just how our bodies are wired, but we're also in an environment that is wholly incongruent with how we've evolved. So, one of the things that we know, right? We know about there's this big release of a variety of neurochemicals that contribute to our emotional well-being, our emotional regulation, our ability to learn, etc. But what's super interesting is that when we have prolonged periods of inactivity, so it's a reward, right? When we get that neurochemical uh, letdown when we are moving and when we're physically active. And so what's interesting is that our brains never evolved to have a rescue plan when there were prolonged periods of inactivity. So
Mm.
over time, when we are inactive, the basically those neurochemicals that get produced with people who are regular exercisers get downregulated over time so that when the person comes back who's been inactive for a really long period of time starts moving again, they don't get those rewards, right? It feels really, really bad, right? And they're focused on why is everybody else feeling good and what's wrong with me because I'm not feeling good. And so I think even just managing people's expectations so that they know that, the brain didn't have a rescue plan for prolonged periods of inactivity because it just didn't exist, right? Centuries ago. And so having the patience to recognize that you're almost retraining neural circuits, right, and retraining your body to be able to produce those neurochemicals again, and get used to the fact that it can move again.
Well, and to set that expectation and then that there's not anything wrong with you, that as that sensitivity has sunset a bit, like you said, those neurochemicals begin to wane and you are no longer as sensitive to that payoff, that knowing that's the case, this makes me think of, if you know anything about, I know, Leona, about cardiovascular energy systems and that, it kind of takes a little while for the engine to warm up. And so, the first 5 minutes of a run tend to be really unpleasant as you're getting warmed up. And when I first was, like running again after the recovery from my illness, I used to actually chant in my head to get myself over that hump. The first 5 minutes always suck. The first 5 minutes always suck. The first 5 minutes always suck. So that I wouldn't stop, because otherwise I'd just feel like this. I'm going to give up.
That's amazing. That's an amazing story. I think I'm doing that too. My solution has been to go really, really slow. I used to be, famously, I would be very impatient and go out of the gate too fast. And then after about a minute, I would just say, "What am I doing here?" Right? So I definitely resonate with that. I want to go back to this idea that we're a mismatch, right? With our environment, because I think it really matters a great deal. And I think too, when we think about the wellness industry, I'm always super cautious about how much responsibility, and you use the word shame, right, that we place on people, that it's somehow their fault if they're not doing it. And instead, I think we also need to have a yes and, right? So we need to help people to be able to overcome that inertia and be able to move and to be able to take care of themselves. But we also need to think about our environment and policies and access to walking areas, access, how we're protecting clean air and clean water so that we can actually swim in a lake, right? How we are setting up our environments so that people have opportunities to commute to work on a bike path, right? Or alternatively, how we're like balancing some of the contexts and environments that we're in. So I think it's really meaningful to think about how we can be a little bit more holistic, and recognize that all the changes that we've made in the environment may be successful from a capitalistic perspective, but may not always be good for us. And so just because we can doesn't mean we should.
Amen to that. For the listener, you're listening to Better Than Fine. I'm your host, Darlene Marshall, and my guest today, as we are talking about the many different kinds of wellness, is Leona Brandwene. And Leona, I'm going to throw back to what you're talking about right now, but also something that you mentioned earlier, I think all falls under the header of social determinants of wellness, right? That it's not just this one individual. And I think so often I see people using the phrase holistic wellness to refer to, like, well, I can coach on sleep and spirituality and mindset and nutrition and, getting you to move. And that's holistic because it's the whole person. But what you're talking about is holistic beyond the whole person. Do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah. So it's such a great question, right? And it's also such a very complicated question. So,
Oh yeah.
I'll
I throw you the big ones because I know you can handle it.
So I'll say there are genetic, sociocultural, educational, economic, and environmental differences that we are all managing all the time in terms of how we live our lives, right? In an effort to be well. I don't think anybody doesn't want to be well. And that's complicated, right? So I think often in the wellness space, and I know that we were certainly guilty of this when I was working in corporate wellness, but the employee base that we were looking at was largely a white collar employee base, right? So it was a sedentary group. So we could look at and make some assumptions about what their lives were like. I will also say not everybody works in that context, right? And so there are differences between physical activity that we engage in our leisure time versus physical activity that's required because of our job, which may be more repetitive, right? Which may outstretch our physical resources at any given point, where we can start to do ourselves some harm and actually have some injuries on the job. And there's also some evidence that that physical activity has a little bit more of a muted effect on people's health than the physical activity that we engage in voluntarily, and where we can really regulate the amount that we invest so that we don't overdo it ourselves. So all of that is to say, as we look around, right, the differences are pretty profound. And I think that we need to give some attention to concepts like equity, right, and access to environments, even the concept of an environment like clean air. In some economically depressed communities, Well, guess where they build highways? They don't build highways next to affluent communities because it's going to depress the property values, right? And those people tend to lobby well in Washington. Instead, highways are built next to poorer communities. So there are things like air quality, right? When you think about even communities that are built next to bus stations and how and buses that are idling, right, and producing a lot of pollutants that end up really harming people. It's really something to consider, right, in terms of that the access to the ability to be well is important for everyone and it's not equal for everyone. And so I think we need to look at some of those things. And I think that we also need to start thinking of ourselves in terms of a community that's invested in one another, because when we raise the well-being of everyone, right, we can really make a difference in our own lives and our own well-being. So I don't see it as like a really zero-sum game. I know I'm talking around a lot of different areas, but the social determinants of health are real, right? Whether or not we have access to education, whether or not we have access to employment, right? That supports our health, right, and doesn't harm our health, whether we have access to a living wage so we don't have to work 2 jobs instead of 1 job. All of these things really matter to our ability to be well. You cannot possibly get adequate sleep if you are working 2 8-hour shifts in a row and trying to take care of your kids at the same time. That is just not going to happen. So I think that there are just some pragmatic realities behind that. And I think our ability to affect that needs to happen at the policy level, right? With governments and how we, in the perspectives that we take around how to ensure the most vulnerable in our society have access to the well-being that other people have just taken for granted their whole lives.
Yeah, and I so appreciate that pragmatic unpacking of it. I knew I'd asked you a big, expansive question, and I also knew you could nail it because, like you're saying, like we were joking about earlier, it's the unpopular kid on the playground, right? It's much more fun to talk about, what kind of bath bomb you think your followers should have than to talk about food deserts and policy around, social determinants and pollution and clean water in Flint, right?
Yes.
It's way more fun and way easier for people to wrap their head around. But I think if we're going to talk about all these different levels, the many kinds of wellness, it means talking about those things. And so you're listening to Better Than Fine. My guest is Leona Brandwene, not Briona. You just got me so in my head. Leona Brandwene, and we're talking about the many kinds of wellness. But I think that actually talking about bath bombs as a wellness prescription is a nice dovetail into this next idea that I want to explore with you, which is around, you and I believe very strongly in the concept of evidence-based practice, right? That what we're going to recommend to a client or a student is going to be something that is informed by research or underpinned by some kind of evidence and is appropriate for that person. And you've described this idea of wellness as ideology. Do you want to speak to a little bit about what you mean by that phrase, and then also just the difference in those two core ideas?
Sure. So the word ideology, right? I think we're mostly familiar with it being a set of beliefs that drive a political or economic set of policies, right? But I think it can be applied to a lot of different domains, and I think it can be applied to wellness too, right? So unlike something like, say, religion, which relies on faith about a number of unknowns that are undiscoverable, right? So the question of whether there's a higher power or what their nature is like is probably undiscoverable. So it relies us to go, it means that we have to go on faith and we have to rely on faith. On the flip side of that, when we're talking about human wellness and the body and how our bodies interact with the environment around us, what we know about human wellness continues to evolve, and it's mostly discoverable because we can use the scientific method to discover that.
Yay,
So,
science.
yay, science, right? So, and right, I mean, there are things that we take for granted today that were very ideologically driven in the past, right? So the concept of the germ theory of disease, right? And we're in a pandemic right now, but the germ theory of disease at one point it was a mystery as to what caused disease. And so people thought that it was, it was attributed to everything from evil spirits, right, to miasma, right, or bad night air. Like odors were considered something that might cause disease. At one point, there was something called the big stink in Paris, right, where everybody was paranoid that they were going to get sick. And it wasn't until there were scientists like Joseph Lister, Robert Koch, Louis Pasteur, who began discovering these microscopic agents, right, that could be minimized through sanitation and eventually leveraged through vaccination, that we really started to shift the needle on infectious disease. Even the concept of something like washing, a physician washing their hands in between births that they were supporting between mothers reduced maternal infection rates and subsequently maternal mortality too. So we learned, we evolved, we were able to increase or improve our practice based on some of those observations. And I think it's not much different today, right? So we have a scientific method that enables us to test ideas in a manner, and this is important, that minimizes our cognitive biases, so that we are able to draw conclusions that are more likely to be true than draw conclusions that are likely to be faulty. It is imperfect, most certainly. It evolves, and it can be a very organic process over time. But it is important that we have some way, right, to be able to overcome those biases. And the other part about science that I think is super cool is that it's crowdsourced, right? So we have a lot of scientists that are inquiring about things and thinking about them from different perspectives from a lot of different areas. And they all turn to each other to see what's out there in the literature before they begin doing their own work. So it's like the learning doesn't start at the bottom of the hill every time, right? They're trying to build on work that's gone before. And so, science tends to correct itself over time. And so, we see new studies come out that can either confirm or disconfirm results. We look at a portfolio of evidence to make a determination rather than any one single study. So it's really cool that we have this, right? And it's something that is relatively new and has really contributed to a wild escalation in human knowledge, in civilization. There are so many things that have emerged that are good from this. And you can imagine, right, if we were in the midst of a pandemic and we were still believing that it was evil spirits or odor,
Yes.
right, that had caused this, right? The fact that we were able to scientifically discover what had caused this gave us tools to be able to fight it, to ensure that we were hopefully, mitigating some of the harmful effects.
Well, there's a few things I want to reflect back to you. The first is even just talking about that process of being in the pandemic. I was in New York City, in Brooklyn, in March 2020. And I remember, not wearing a mask to go to the store when the outbreak had really started in earnest and they had started to shut the city down. But I happen to have Clorox wipes and Clorox wiping everything before I touched it when I went to the store. It was like, because we thought it was touch transfer, right? And even just the quickness and evolution of understanding then.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to speak to, you talked about, not just the crowdsourcing of it, but the, drawing conclusions, not presenting necessarily as fact. I know that this works in this way, but like, okay, we can imply based off of how most things work that this thing is going to work like this. So let's try it. And one thing that I always like to highlight about that is like, not everything's going to work for everybody. And if there's a wellness practitioner out there saying like, okay, you're going to do this thing just like this, you're going to get this outcome, boom, it always works because I know what I'm doing, that person probably doesn't know what they're doing. They're probably just trying to sell you something because not everything works for everyone. And we all have a certain amount of like genetic and dispositional and experiential like variance just in our humanity. Like, you're different than me, Leona. We can see it if anybody's watching on YouTube. It's obvious that we are different and we are at different points in our lives. We are genetically different. Like, we're going to react differently to the same, in positive psychology, we call it an intervention. But the movement prescription, the meditation, the whatever, it's going to be different, right? And to not put it off as, well, I know what it is, and that science doesn't work that way, and that it's not supposed to work that way. And so we shouldn't expect it to.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to quote the amazing coach Ted Lasso and say that every person is a different kind of person. And if you remember that, right, it helps a lot. So even as we are looking at what we're learning, right, with a broad-based population study that we might see in a scientific journal, even like recognizing, right, that the what that might be predicting is, maybe 4% of the variance in a population, helps us to be a little bit humble, right, about what it is
Mhm.
that we're actually suggesting, and that it's not a guarantee for every single person that they are going to emerge with the same results that they see in that scientific journal. There is, of course, variation, right, amongst even the study subjects that were part of the original study. And there's certainly going to be variation through the population itself, especially if the population isn't matched. So I think it's really what you're pointing out, Darlene, is so very important because everybody has a different context. We talked about the sociological influences on our well-being. We can think about our genetic makeup, right, and how different that is. Even our own family situations, the environment that we're in, the air quality and that's local to us, all sorts of things. It makes it very complicated and almost to the point where we could be like, oh, well, then we can't really predict anything because since everybody is so different, it should just be a free for all. I don't think that's true either, right? There's
Yeah.
some middle ground, right, where we can say, okay, here's what we know from the science. So odds are, right, that we can predict that it's more likely that you're going to have this effect taking this approach, but maybe not, right? Your mileage may vary. And so let's test it out. But this is a really good place for us to start.
Well, and that even within an individual, right? Like I think of some of the things, when I was in MAP and some of the exercises we were doing pre-pandemic and doing them now, I'm going to have a different effect. And so I think to your point, it's about like test and retest, right? Like, let me try it. Let me try the thing that there's a good body of evidence to suggest. Let's take movement for an example. Like, okay, most people would agree at this point that for most people, most of the time, movement is going to be good. And, I so appreciate throughout this conversation that you've said physical activity and not exercise, because when we're talking about, the mental health benefits, the, productivity benefits, pick your benefit, going off and doing a thing you like that is active is a different effect than like having a personal trainer make you do burpees when you hate burpees, right? Very different effect. And most people are going to get a benefit from more activity when appropriate, right? And we can take that leap and try it. And then if you don't like it, let's use that information to try something else, right? And that iterative process of kind of like science can be applied back to you as a person.
Yeah, yeah, beautiful. So beautifully stated, right? I love that idea of test and retest, right? Start with a small test of change. And if that doesn't work out, look at what happened and make some adjustments from there, right? So it would be the equivalent of if I watched, the first 10 minutes of a movie and it was a terrible movie. And I was just like, well, I'm never going to watch a movie ever again, right?
No movie.
Right, like seriously, like, or if I
Yeah.
read like the first 5 pages of a book and I'm like, this book is terrible. I'm done with books, right?
All books are terrible.
All books are terrible. I'm never doing that for the rest of my life, right? Of course, right? That seems so silly when we talk about something that we are so familiar with, like reading books or watching movies. I think that the same thing applies to
So what you're
movement,
trying
how
to
we
tell me,
use our
Leona,
lives.
is all entertainment is horrible and that it erodes my well-being, right?
I just said it. It must be
Yeah,
truth, right?
duh. All movies and all books are terrible. Um,
Please strike that from the record.
yeah, sorry, I will not hold you accountable to that statement. So, how else do you think, an informed individual, an interested individual, someone who wants to be proactive in meaningful wellness practice, how else might they parse out this theological noise from meaningful practice in their own right or for their clients?
Hmm. Whew, such a wonderful question. So
I'll give you the big ones.
I'll tell you, Darlene, you know how to serve up some whoppers here. So um, So a couple of things that I might say, right, in terms of distinguishing between, we often say, let the buyer beware, right? And we're all familiar with that term, but what does it mean in practice? So I think that as we are scanning the environment, right, and looking for um, credible sources of information in the environment. Some of the things that we can look at include is this based on any peer reviewed evidence, right? Are we seeing anything that where we know it's emerging from a scientific journal where there were many eyes that were looking at this information and suggesting that that this information is valid? The second thing is that I think we need to ensure that that we're practically wise and that we're balancing multiple conflicting goals and motivations for well-being. So I will say I've seen some fitness movements that have done a wonderful job of leveraging a sense of community, right? A sense of investment and perhaps motivation for goals, but may become so hyper focused on pushing the envelope of human limits that those limits can be exceeded and it costs people through injury or burnout. And that
Mhm.
cost can be real, right? Like costing someone a lifelong love and pursuit of a particular sport to me is way too much expense.
Mhm.
I've got a daughter who competes in triathlon at the elite level. And my goal as a parent through all of that has not been to get her to a college where she's going to race triathlon. My goal all the way through has been to protect her lifelong love of this sport or some other way, right, of being active in the world and finding the sense of meaning and passion that she derives from that in something else. And I think that we certainly can beat it out of people by developing these myopic views around, I'm just going to crush this workout with 100 burpees. And I always think about that and I say, okay, why?
Why?
Why are you doing that, right? And it may be that you're very motivated by that, but I also think we need to attune to our multiple motivations, and to hold on to our wallets if it seems as though we're being asked to pursue a single motivation, with at the expense of some of the other aspects of our lives or well-being.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to consider when someone is giving you any kind of wellness or fitness information, if that person is also trying to sell something related to the thing that they are trying to sell you the benefits on. And so if they're out there, pitching mushroom coffee, and they also sell mushroom coffee, well, there's probably an ulterior motive there. And I used to this particular style of fitness that you're talking about as a functional movement focused trainer who worked with special populations primarily. I used to say that those kind of fitness movements pay my rent because inevitably somebody was getting hurt and then they were going to need some guidance. Uh,
Absolutely. So, Darlene, I think you're like such an exemplar of this, of somebody who really understands how the complicated nature of our human bodies and how we can balance some of those multiple motivations. Because as you said, right, they're paying your rent, right? So the people, when you're doing when you have the myopic focus of doing 100 and then 101 burpees and then 102 at the expense of anything else, inevitably we can push our limits in a way where it does compromise other things. And it's often we take our health and we take our bodies for granted until they come under some duress or some harm. And then we quickly realize how important it is to protect them. So I will just say I have had such admiration for you since I've met you because I know how you have walked that walk yourself and you have been able to see and understand how important it is that it's almost like a sacred duty, right, that we have to people in order to be able to support them in being healthy and well their whole lives, right, and not just in getting to a particular goal.
I was glad when Eric cut to your face instead of mine, because I can feel that I am blushing. So thank you. In MAP, we talk about calling and purpose and meaning. And I feel that way very strongly about the types of things that you and I are talking about. And the compliment resonates deeply, Leona, because of who you are to me. And thank you. I am now very embarrassed. But we're going to leave it there. So you've been listening to the Better Than Fine podcast. My guest has been Leona Brandwene as we talk about the many kinds of wellness. And Leona, thank you so much for your time and your energy and for sharing your brain candy with us. I so appreciate you.
Oh my goodness. Same back to you, my friend. As I said, I know that you were uncomfortable with that compliment, but I'll say it again. You're a pro and you're an exemplar at this. And the world is better because Darlene Marshall is in it. So thank you.
Oh, I think my heart just exploded. Okay, well, now that I'm thoroughly embarrassed, you can support the show by subscribing on whatever podcast platform or YouTube that you are listening on. If you're on YouTube, go ahead and hit that like button. Leave us your comments, your thoughts, your ideas, your questions, because we do use them to feed forward in the show. And if you want to find me, you can do so on LinkedIn. You can also find me on Instagram. I am darlene.coach, and I would absolutely love to hear from you. So we're going to leave it there. And thanks.